is real history that completely altered the course of human history. So much so that you and I are still living with the consequences today. The life of Constantine shaped the way the Christian faith would unfold over the next 1700 years. Now, none of this came as a surprise to students of Bible prophecy. In fact, the prophetic books of the Bible, like Daniel or Revelation, they contain a detailed, unbroken history of the world written thousands of years in advance, and it's never been wrong, not even once. The details would blow your mind. They actually made a believer out of me. You would not believe what the Bible actually predicted ahead of time. That's why I'm really thankful that this church has invited you to be here. These people that you're with are really dedicated Bible students. They have some of the best material around for studying Bible prophecy and other major themes of Scripture. I think you'll be glad if you checked it out. You see, Shadow Empire is just scratching the surface. You wouldn't believe what else there is to discover. And now, today's presentation.
The world, forever changed. His legacy, an empire reaching across centuries. His name, Constantine. Shadow Empire.
The world knows him as Constantine, the great conqueror who managed to unite the Roman Empire, and the man who turned the religion of Rome completely on its head. He propelled an obscure Jewish sect into the global religion we know as Christianity. But what most people don't know is how this incredible man got his start, and how profoundly his roots shaped his thinking, and how he changed the thinking of the whole world. He was born to a peasant girl who had to prove that her son's father was the governor of Dalmatia, a powerful and influential man named Flavius Constantius. But once that happened, once she produced indisputable proof, it started a chain of events that rocked the whole planet. There's a passage in the last book of the Bible that makes reference to 10 days of fierce persecution that the followers of Jesus would suffer. It's found in the 7 letters to the 7 churches of Asia Minor in the book of Revelation. They were 7 letters from Jesus to a region of the earth that eventually became the headquarters for the whole Roman Empire. Most people naturally think of the city of Rome as the capital because it was known as the Eternal City, the birthplace of the empire. It was the home of Romulus and Remus. But while Rome was always important to the Romans, over time the center of power actually moved to the east. And some of the Christians moved here too, even though their roots were in Jerusalem. By the time John writes the book of Revelation, toward the end of the 1st century, he's a prisoner on the island of Patmos, a Roman penal colony way out in the Aegean Sea, some 40 miles off of the coast. Tradition has it that he was actually the pastor of the church in Ephesus, which is one of the 7 cities mentioned in the book of Revelation. Over the years, Bible students have found an interesting pattern in the first 3 chapters of Revelation. The 7 letters were written to very real churches that existed right here in Asia Minor back in the 1st century. But the astonishing thing about those letters is the way they also seem to track the entire history of Christianity. It's as if each letter actually predicts some phase of the development of Christianity far in advance. The first letter is addressed to the church in Ephesus, and it seems to clearly point to 1st century Christianity, a time when the church was still being led by people who knew Jesus personally. The second letter is addressed to the people of Smyrna, a city whose very name implies something being crushed. Smyrna, you see, is virtually synonymous with the word myrrh. which you probably know as one of the gifts the wise men brought to baby Jesus. Remember, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Myrrh was a sweet-smelling fragrance you obtained by crushing the myrrh plant. You had to brutally destroy it to bring out the nice scent. And oddly enough, that's exactly what happened to the Christian church as the Roman Empire became more and more aware of its presence, as they began to consider it a threat to Roman stability. Christians worshipped a king who said he would cleanse the earth by fire one day and establish his own kingdom. And of course, that started Roman tongues wagging, and people started telling the most outrageous stories about Christ's followers. It was a very unhappy time for the Christians, to say the least. And most Bible students believe there's a special message from Jesus to those suffering Christians, a message encoded in the letter to Smyrna. Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. It fits perfectly. By the end of the first century, the Christians started to feel the wrath of the Roman Empire. For the most part, the Romans were actually pretty tolerant. They allowed you to practice any religion you wanted, that is, until they perceived that you might be a threat to the unity of the empire. Roman culture loved a scapegoat. They loved to blame someone when the favor of the Roman gods no longer seemed to be falling on them. And by the end of the first century, the Christians were it. They were the scapegoat.
At one point, there was a fire here in the city of Rome, and something like 70% of the city burned to the ground. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, Nero blamed the Christians because, after all, they were the ones talking about the end of the world with fire. This is the moment that Christians started meeting with all those cruel and painful deaths. This is the moment they took Paul outside the city and beheaded him.
And it was at this time that they took Peter and locked him up in a dark, musty cell here at the bottom of Mamertine prison. And then they let him outside the city to be crucified, upside down. Now, why did they do it upside down? Well, it's because Peter didn't feel worthy to be killed the way Jesus was. "Oh, don't do this," he said. "This is too good for me." So they turned him over. Now, to this day, there's an altar down here in the Mamertine that has an upside-down cross on it. And the conspiracy theorists will tell you that's because there's a satanic plot afoot here in the city of Rome. But it's nonsense. That cross is upside down because that's how Peter died.
It was the beginning of the persecution mentioned in the letter to Smyrna. That persecution would come to a head. It would reach its absolute apex for a period of 10 days. That's what the letter said. And this is the point where the stories of Jesus and Constantine actually begin to merge.
Several centuries after its birth, the Roman Empire became a little unstable. And out on the battlefields of the empire, something incredible took place. In 284 AD, right here near the modern-day city of Izmit, Turkey, the commander of the imperial bodyguard was suddenly declared the Roman emperor by his troops. His name was Diocletian, and his rise to power was very unusual. 1 year before he came to power, the Emperor Carus suddenly died while fighting the Persians. We think he actually had a heart attack. And just before his death, his two sons had been made Caesars, which was kind of like a vice emperor. He was trying to build a family dynasty. Now, after Carus died, one son was given control of the west, and the other son was given control of the east. The son who got the west, his name was Carinus, and he was such a brutal man that eventually one of his own soldiers stabbed him in the back for raping his wife.
The other son, the one who got control of the East, his name was Numerian, and we think somebody murdered him too. And some historians think that Diocletian actually had him killed. Here's what we know. They said Numerian had an eye infection, so he had to spend all day, every day riding inside a litter, a hand-carried carriage. He had to be in there to keep the dust and light out of his eye. But after a number of days, when a slave opened the door, there he was, the emperor's son, dead as a doorpost. Now that was a real problem for Diocletian because he was responsible for the emperor's safety. So what did he do? He found a scapegoat. He blamed Numerian's father-in-law, a guy by the name of Lucius Aper. In the middle of the night, he went into Lucius's tent and had him arrested, and then he gathered his legion commanders all around the tent and dumped the badly decomposing body of Numerian on the ground. "You did this," he said. And of course, Lucius denied it. So they had a trial just 3 miles from here.
In the name of Rome!
Diocletian made a speech in front of all the soldiers. For the past 4 days, he said, legion commanders have been asking Lucius to arrange a meeting with the emperor, and the requests were denied. I, the commander of the Protectorate, asked Lucius about the emperor's health, and I was told he was suffering from an eye ailment. I didn't become suspicious until a faithful soldier reported that for days the emperor hadn't even left the litter to relieve himself. At the end of the speech, he pointed straight at Lucius. He is the murderer. Of course, Lucius blew a gasket. "He's the murderer, not me," he responded. "Are you going to believe the words of a plotter? The words of a filthy son of a slave?" That was the last straw for Diocletian. He pulled out a knife and stabbed Lucius on the spot. Then his men unanimously declared him the new emperor. But emperor was a big job. The Roman territories were huge and hard to control. So Diocletian did something pretty smart. He divided responsibility amongst 4 men with 2 halves of the empire. In the east, he would have 2 emperors, a senior known as an Augustus and a junior known as a Caesar. The same was true for the other half of the empire in the west. So in the east, you had Diocletian himself, the #1 emperor, and his assistant, a Caesar by the name of Galerius. Over in the west, Maximian was appointed Augustus, the senior emperor, and his junior, the Caesar, was a guy by the name of Flavius Constantius, Constantine's father. Now, as soon as Constantine's father got the appointment, he moved his family to the city of Arelate in modern-day France. So, what does that have to do with 10 days of persecution? Well, follow me carefully because this is really pretty amazing. When Flavius Constantius became the junior emperor, or the Caesar in the West, he suddenly divorces Helena, the mother of Constantine, because she was a commoner, just a concubine. And of course, a Caesar can't have a village girl for a wife. And besides, he now had the opportunity to marry his senior emperor's daughter, a girl by the name of Theodora. Now, it's at this point, during the bitter disappointment of divorce, that many historians think Constantine's mother, Helena, became a Christ follower, a Christian. Now, think about that. Constantine's mother belongs to one of the highest-ranking families in the Roman Empire, an empire that hates Christianity. And suddenly, she turns to Jesus. But the boy, Constantine, well, he didn't turn to Christianity. History suggests that he reacted a little differently. He got bitter and angry. Now, of course, we don't know that for sure, but the circumstantial evidence suggests it. What we do know is that he's all grown up now, and he gets sent to go work for the Emperor Diocletian. He becomes a centurion in the imperial guard, and he works with Diocletian for something like 11 years. That's a long time. You can't work with a guy like Diocletian for that long and not have something rub off on you. Historians suggest that Constantine learned much of his own management style from one of the most notorious emperors in all of history. Across the ocean, down in Egypt, Diocletian was suddenly faced with a big problem. A group of Gnostics known as the Manichaeans. Now, the Manichaeans were a religious movement started by a Persian prophet by the name of Mani. And he taught that you can find salvation through education and fasting by living an ascetic, self-denying life. Unfortunately for the Christians, while Mani the prophet was not a Christian, he did borrow some of his teachings from the Christian faith. In fact, he declared himself to be an apostle. Most Christians weren't too keen on that because Mani also taught stuff that was completely at odds with Christianity, like reincarnation. Mani was also a fan of Buddha, Zoroaster, and Krishna. Manichaeanism had some of the trappings of Christianity, but they were not Christians. But that didn't matter to the Romans because they didn't care what you believed, as long as you weren't a threat to the empire. By all means, go ahead, become a Manichaean. The emperor will not care unless you do what the Manichaeans did. They staged a revolt, and that was a problem. Diocletian had no choice but to take action. He suddenly marched into Egypt to put an end to the rebellion. He believed that the Manichaeans were planted in Egypt by the Persian king, spies sent into Roman territory to destabilize it. So Diocletian brutally squashed their movement. He literally sent the Manichaeans to the salt mines. And of course, Constantine, who was now 25 years old, was there for the whole thing. The Roman persecution of the Manichaeans gives us a great example of what would happen if you threatened the stability of the empire, or if you even appeared to be a threat. And the crushing of the Manichaean revolt was a disturbing foreshadow of what was just about to happen to the Christians.
As far as the Romans were concerned, there was a crucial link between the Manichaeans and the Christians. Roman religion, with all its pagan gods, really didn't offer an afterlife or any kind of eternal reward. It also didn't offer any kind of redemption from sin. But the prophet Mani did offer that stuff, and so did Jesus. As far as the Romans were concerned, they were both mystery religions because both groups seemed to offer secret knowledge, this secret path to heaven. Now, in reality, that wasn't actually true of the Christians. But there was another group that latched onto Christian thinking, a group known as the Gnostics. And they believed that their followers had secret sacred knowledge. In fact, that's where they got their name. Gnostics are named for the Greek word gnosis, or knowledge. But the Christians? Well, they did have a mystery, the mystery of the gospel, as Paul put it. But they were willing to share that mystery with anybody who was willing to listen.
For the most part, however, Diocletian didn't really care what the Christians believed. He did care about the Manichaeans because they were a political threat. But the Christians? Well, they actually even had a church right in Nicomedia, proof that they were still relatively free in the early years of Diocletian's reign. Diocletian didn't really have a problem with these people. But the junior emperor in the East, Diocletian's right-hand man, the Caesar, he did have a problem with Christians.
His name was Galerius, and in the year 302, he started to complain that the Christians in Nicomedia were offending the Romans by disregarding the traditional Roman gods. These people disrespect our gods, he said, and if you disrespect our gods, then you are disrespecting the emperor.
And I guess to some extent, that was probably true. Not that the Christians were trying to disrespect the emperor, but as some of them started to rise up through Roman society, they became more exposed to Rome's religion. And the emperor was considered to be the son of a god, or even one of the gods. And if you disrespected the gods, you were also disrespecting the divine authority of the emperor. Now, Galerius, the second in command, the Caesar, he had a mother named Romula who came to this city from modern-day Bulgaria. She was a pagan priestess who worshipped the ancient gods of the mountains. And when she discovered that Christians were not interested in her pagan rituals, she got angry. She hated them. And of course, her son Galerius had the ear of the emperor Diocletian. Now, at about the same time, a pagan philosopher by the name of Porphyry started writing these vitriolic hit pieces against the Christians. And his writings were so influential that even after he died, Christians still felt the need to answer his charges. When you combine that with the hatred of Galerius and his mother, you suddenly had this renewed discomfort with the Christian religion. They'd had a pretty good life for almost 50 years, no real persecution. But now the heat was rising again, and with a junior emperor eager to get rid of the followers of Jesus, something had to give. For the first 17 years of Diocletian's reign, he was so busy securing his empire that he never really thought about the Christians. Of course, he knew they existed, but the only thing he really knew about them was that Christian soldiers obeyed his orders just like everybody else. But after the Manichaean revolt and the complaints of Galerius, he started to suspect that maybe Christians were a problem. In September of 302, Diocletian went to visit some of his frontier garrisons in the Balkans. And because of Galerius' insistence that the Christians were no good, he started to ask questions. And everybody he asked, commanders, civilian administrators, the locals, they all told him the same thing. Christians were good citizens and faithful soldiers. But they did have one complaint. The Christians would not participate in public sacrifices. And the army was worried that eventually the Roman gods would get offended and quit helping them on the battlefield. Their numbers are growing, someone said to the emperor. The army is full of these Christians, and so is the civil list. Their first loyalty is to a crucified Jew they call Dominus, and they claim that Jesus is Lord and Savior. Now, that's the part that really bothered Diocletian. Here he was, doing his very best to unify a massive empire, and the Christians were loyal to someone else. In October of 302, he called a meeting of high-ranking officials, and he got more disturbing news. A man by the name of Heracles, the governor of Bithynia, said, "Don't you think this cult is like the cult of Mithras? The followers of Mithras never spoke against the Roman gods, but the Christians consider our gods to be demons, unholy spirits, and they claim that the Hebrew rebel they worship is the only true God." That bothered Diocletian, but he was still reluctant to use violence against the Christians because, well, violence doesn't tend to create loyalty. And he knew from history that if he tried to kill the Christians, they would just voluntarily march to their deaths, glad to be martyrs. And that would only attract more people to the movement. So Diocletian started with civil penalties. He just dismissed all the Christians from the army, and he fired all the Christians in his palace. And to make sure he was doing the right thing, he sent a messenger to the famous oracle at Didyme to ask Apollo what he thought. And Apollo told the emperor, through the oracle of course, that Christians were the reason he had no message for the king. The presence of Christians was keeping the Roman gods from speaking. That was the last straw. On February 23 of 303, soldiers suddenly stormed the Christian church here in Nicomedia. They knocked down the building with a battering ram, and they burned all the books. Galerius actually wanted to burn the church, but Diocletian said, no, that would endanger the whole city, so we'll just use a battering ram. The next day, they posted a public edict against Christians. They no longer had a right to worship. And to make matters worse, if you attacked a Christian or robbed him, you could do it with absolute impunity, because they no longer had access to the Roman courts. Then a few months later, the leaders of the church were rounded up and told that if they did not offer sacrifices to the emperor, they would be put to death. The same day they posted the edict, a Christian by the name of Euethius unfortunately lost his temper and ripped it down. He stomped on it and shouted insults against the emperor, a direct challenge to Diocletian. So he was immediately arrested and taken before a judge. In the courtroom, the guards described what he had done, and the judge asked him, "Is that true?" "Yes, it is." "So you admit that you insulted the sacred person of the Augustus?" "For me," Euethius said, "only the person of Christ is sacred." Now, pay attention to what the judge said next, because it's important. "If I condemn you, it will not be for your religion, but for your insolent act against the emperor." The judge was trying to defend religious liberty. Because remember, the Romans didn't actually care about your religion. What they cared about was political stability. That's the reason they allowed Jesus to be crucified. They didn't care what he taught. They didn't care what he believed. They only cared that he was perceived as a threat to political stability. Euethius answered the judge, "I insulted the emperor only because he insulted my Lord and Savior. If you kill me, you will not give me death, but life eternal. I pity you." "You are an idiot," the judge said, "but the law does not exempt idiots from just punishment. Take him away, torture him, and then burn him on the stake." That's precisely what they did. They hung him on an iron hook and whipped him all night long. And when the sun rose in the morning, they tied him to a stake and burned him to death. Euethius was the first victim of the Diocletian persecution. He might have been the last, except for something that happened just a few weeks later: a fire in Diocletian's palace. It started on the ground floor near the slave quarters. And today, some historians believe that Galerius actually started the fire himself, trying to frame the Christians. It was the same thing Nero did almost 250 years earlier. He burned the city of Rome and blamed the Christians. So, how did Galerius blame the Christians? He planned a public ceremony to thank the Roman gods for saving the emperor's family, who survived the fire. And he knew the Christians would not participate. Anybody who doesn't participate, he said, must not be glad that we survived, and those people are obviously party to this crime. Now, Diocletian loved the plan, so he called for the priests of Jupiter and organized a public sacrifice. Everybody had to walk past the fire and toss in just a pinch of incense. 2 people refused to do it, both of them lifelong secretaries in the service of Diocletian. They were people Diocletian loved, and he tried to save them. "Just one little pinch," he said. But one of those Christians answered, "Domine, I have served you faithfully for many years. I would give my earthly life for you. But you are asking me to forfeit my eternal life. This I cannot do." Diocletian had no choice. He had the man tortured and beheaded. 2 weeks later, there was another fire in the palace, one that started during a lightning storm. So there is a pretty good chance it was actually accidental. But still, the Christians got the blame. Persecution put down deep roots, and the persecution lasted exactly 10 years. You will have tribulation 10 days, the book of Revelation said, and in Bible prophecy, a day is often used to represent a year. It seems that even before the Diocletian persecution began, the Christians knew it was coming. The God they worshiped, the humble carpenter's son from Nazareth, was able to warn them centuries in advance that the church would experience some incredible hardship as they took the gospel to the world. That message, Revelation's letter to Smyrna,
was a message from someone who knew a thing or two about death. It's a letter from someone who identifies himself as the first and the last, someone who was dead and came back to life. Now, why were the early Christians so willing to die for their faith? It was because the God they worshiped had already conquered the grave. And shortly before the persecution started, he had also conquered the heart of one humble woman, a girl named Helena. And Helena's son had a front row seat to the Diocletian persecutions. Constantine was also the man who finally brought that persecution to an end, exactly 10 years later.
Now, under the Emperor Diocletian, the persecution eventually got really bad. So bad, in fact, that God actually forewarned his church that it was coming. The entire future of the church was revealed to an aging prisoner of faith who was sent to a prison colony on the island of Patmos. And what he saw has been recorded for you and for me in the book of Revelation. It says, "Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer." Jesus told John, and so it was no big surprise for Christians when they began to die for their faith. Now, we'll notice the Romans had a habit of seizing the kingdom by force. Politics and intrigue always led to the next king, including Diocletian, the man credited with the famous 10-year persecution mentioned in Revelation chapter 2. And in a kingdom built on force, it's no surprise that anyone perceived to stand in the way of Roman stability would also meet with deadly force. Now, we saw today that the Manichaeans were wiped out without so much as a blink of an eye. And when that worked, the empire used the same kind of tactics with the Christians. And of course, Constantine was there for all of it. Now, we're only partway through the story, but for right now, we're going to stop. We're going to dig in just a little bit deeper. So what I'd like you to do is pull out study guide number 2, and we'll take just a couple of minutes together and go through it.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the Bible study. So if any of you did not get a Bible study as you walked in, please put your hand up. We'll have somebody walking around handing out Bible studies. Did anybody miss one? Did anybody not get one as they walked in? Yeah, but there's one person there with their hand up. Anybody else? Okay. Well, that was a very interesting and even, I think you could say, sobering presentation by Pastor Boonstra. Without any further ado, we'll go ahead and jump right into the Bible study here. So the Bible study lesson that we're going to be working through right now is the one on the screen, session number 2, talking about persecution of the church. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the presentation today, but we'll also be focusing a lot just on other Bible texts that talk about what does the Bible say about persecution of God's people. So question number 1 in the Bible study lesson says, what were some of the key reasons why Christians didn't fit into the Roman world? You know, whenever I was younger, in high school and whatnot, all that I wanted most in the world was to fit in, you know? You just want to fit in. But as we were looking at this presentation, the Christians did not fit in. And the question is, why? Why did they not fit in? And go ahead and give me some of your answers. Yeah, John. The same reasons we don't fit in today, like money, power. Okay. Any other? The sacrifices, right? Yeah, that was one of the issues. What other reasons were there listed in the presentation of why Christians did not fit in with the Roman culture of the day? You've heard the saying, when in Rome, do like the Romans, right? well, the Christians didn't do that, and that was the problem. Yeah, Jim. Okay. Difference in opinion about religious actions. Yeah, Gary? Right? They would not bow to worship the Roman gods, and particularly the pinch of honor to the emperor, right? Who was their supreme god. But think about the parallels for today. Now, in our country, in the United States, we're blessed to live in a place that, at least at one point was called a Christian country, because we are founded on Christian moral values. And so in some ways, Christians do fit in the United States. But is it true that in some ways we should still not fit in? What are your thoughts? Are there any parallels to our day? Chris? Church and state? Okay. I didn't catch that last part. Okay, taking God out of the school. Yeah, they're taking God out of educational system. So that's kind of they're telling teachers, you're not allowed to say anything about God. We can talk about evolution, but you cannot say anything about God. So that's kind of an awkward thing for people who believe but cannot say anything about it. John? Right, okay. That's right, yeah. So, but this is a really important question. What does the separation of church and state mean? Because it's being interpreted differently by different people. Go ahead. Okay. Yes. So I think James just is nailing it here. He said that originally the separation of church and state was designed so that there would be no government power which was promoted by one particular spiritual entity, like the Anglican Church in England or whatever, and that they would oppress anybody that didn't believe particularly in their way. But now the separation of church and state is being reinterpreted to be understood as saying we cannot have anything that has any religious value of any significance, or that's combination of church and state, right? So there's a lot of question marks here of how to live that out, and I don't think we're going to solve all that today, but let's see some of the answers. Right? Okay, that's a really big question of okay. So John is pointing out the fact that they're giving respect and autonomy, giving Muslim individuals the right to do their prayers towards Mecca, but they're taking away things like the Pledge of Allegiance because it says the word God in it. So anyhow, I think that I'm so tempted to keep going down that road, but I'm gonna pull back, and I'm gonna go back to the presentation. One of the answers here on the slides here, it says is Christians were not exempt from emperor worship as the Jews were, and thus were perceived as a threat to the stability of the empire. That's why they didn't fit in. Another reason was Christians weren't comfortable with key aspects of Roman culture, such as violent entertainment, pagan educational systems, and wouldn't integrate into society. Now, does any of that kind of end up as a parallel in our culture today? I think that's some of the reasons why Christians don't or maybe shouldn't fit in at times in our culture as well, is because a lot of our entertainment in the world today is kind of violent and pagan, etc. Another reason listed here is Christians were perceived as threats to the economic prosperity by the vendors of the pagan religious items. So they talked about how the meat sales were going down in the market, etc., and the people were upset about that, right? Are there any other reasons or ideas that come to your mind about why Christians don't fit in or shouldn't fit in into our culture currently? Go ahead. Okay, so I don't know if all of you heard what James was saying, but he's referring to the government making permissible homosexual marriage and the controversies that each person or group has to deal with that. Like a lot of denominations out there today are questioning whether they should allow their ministers to perform marriages for homosexual people. Obviously, that's one of the questions that came up in my group because I'm a pastor. Should we be marrying homosexual people? Of course, in our particular denomination, we decided that we choose respectfully not to. There are other people, other denominations that have taken a different path on that one. But you're right, James, that's one of the ways that we don't fit in currently in culture. Culture says that that's normal, acceptable, and that's just part of who they are, and we need to respect them for that. And Christians are trying to find a way of navigating those waters now that is culturally the norm, so to speak. Yeah, Kenneth, do you have your hand up? Thank you, Kenneth. That's a sermon in of itself. I'm not going to try to repeat that for our internet viewing audience, but you're actually going in directly into where the rest of this Bible study is going. So I'm going to go on to the next question. Sorry, John, go ahead. Okay. Thank you for, I'll just repeat what John said. He said that his Bible talks about the fact that there's only one unpardonable sin, and that's not the one listed. So thank you for your thoughts there on that, John. We're going to, instead of getting into a debate about homosexual marriage, we're going to move on to question 2. Question 2 says, what did Jesus tell his disciples would happen to them after he returned to heaven? Okay. So we're going to turn to the Gospels and read a couple of verses here and see what Jesus says, to what he warns his disciples about. The first one we're going to read is from John chapter 15, verses 18 through 21. And it says, if the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but I choose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. And if they kept my word, they will keep yours also. But all these things they will do to you for my name's sake, because they do not know him who sent me. Another verse here, Matthew chapter 24, verse 9. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. This is Jesus talking about what's going to happen to his disciples. It says, for then there will be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. Unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Okay, So those are some pretty intense verses. What did Jesus tell his disciples are going to happen to them after he returns to heaven? Persecution. And a one word, persecution. Any other thoughts on that? Would anybody like to expound on those verses? Anything that jumped out at you? That they're going to be killed? That they're going to kill him, yeah? So here's a question I have. Notice that the last two verses that I read actually came from Matthew chapter 24. The first one was from John chapter 15, and that was actually Jesus talking directly to his 12 about what's literally going to happen to them, that group, once he goes to heaven. But the second two verses actually come from Matthew 24. And if you're familiar with Matthew 24, that is sometimes called the apocalypse of Matthew, Matthew chapter 24. It's very similar to the book of Revelation because it has a lot of events talking about last day events, what's going to happen before Christ's coming. So Matthew 24 verses are actually not talking about what's going to happen in the day right after Jesus leaves, but it's actually talking about paralleling to what's going to happen in our day at the end of time. So question, will persecution happen again, even in a place like the United States? I think Jesus is unequivocal about it. Yeah. It's already started, you say. Okay. You're referring back to the case of homosexual marriage, how people the bakers refused to bake the food for that, and how they were fined for that. And I agree with you, that is a form of persecution. And I'm not trying to downplay that was persecution, but the persecution that Jesus talks about is of an even more severe nature, right? Something of kind of a different level. And I think that maybe we are seeing just the beginnings of it, but if what Jesus said is going to happen, he says that there's going to be a persecution at the end of time like there never was in all of Earth's history. The 10-day or the 10-year persecution that we learned about, it will not equal what will happen before the end of time. Yes, Victoria. Okay. Yeah, it's going to be a repeat, right, of the past. Well, let's go on to, well, here's the answer to the question. Jesus predicted that his followers would be persecuted. We already discussed that. Going on to question number 3. Why do you suppose God would allow his followers to go through hard times? How should we view hard times that fall on us? So now this is I don't want to step on anybody's toes here because I don't know where each of you go to church or what your religious background is here. But there's something that has become popular to teach these days, and it's called, negatively named, the prosperity gospel. And the idea behind the prosperity gospel is if you love Jesus, he's going to bless you and everything's going to be okay. The problem is that Jesus talks about those who live in the last days, even the ones who love him, receive tribulation. Now, how do we make sense of this, right? Let me read one verse and then I'll take some thoughts. James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. It says, "My brethren, count it all joy," notice the word joy, "when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." So why does God allow people who love him to experience tough times? Okay, to develop patience, yeah? To build character? Choice? What do you mean by that, Dee? Okay. Right? Okay, good. Phyllis. Reluca? So, Reluca, that's my wife speaking. She actually grew up in Romania, and they were required to go to school 6 days a week. And well, her family decided, we are not going to go to school on the day that we go to church. We're going to honor God, and we're going to go to church instead of go to school. Thankfully, her father worked at the school as a school photographer and had friends there, and so they kind of treated her a little bit differently. But Reluca had another friend who also made the same decision and went to the same church, and they would bring her up in front of everybody in the church and at the school meeting, and they would beat her publicly. They would beat her publicly in front of everybody for not attending school and going to church instead of going to school. So, and these days like this, and there are many, many people who were put in jail and tortured for proselytizing in Romania, and this is not that long ago in our lifetime. And that was during communist regime, which is thankfully now gone, but if the Bible is true, these things are going to happen again. I see some other hands, forgive me, we need to move on though. So the answer is God uses trials to hone the character of his followers and to build their faith in him. So we should always be thankful for the blessings of the Lord, but we should not be blaming God or angry at God if that doesn't occur. Let's go on to question 4 now. Question 4 says, what was the response of Christ's disciples when his predictions proved to be true? And what do you think they responded? Why do you think they responded the way they did? And what does this story suggest about civil power and Christian faith? It says to read the story from Acts chapter 5. So we're going to read that, Acts chapter 5, starting in verse 40. It says, and they agreed with them, and when they had called for the apostles and beaten them, they commanded that they should not speak in the name of Jesus, and they let them go. So they departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing, notice the word rejoicing, that they had been counted worthy to suffer the shame for his name. And daily in the temple and in every house, they did not cease teaching and preaching Jesus as the Christ. Now, notice the story. His disciples were taken, they were put in jail, and they were beaten. And then they said, look, we're going to let you out. We're going to take you out of jail, but don't you dare talk about that Jesus man again. And what was their response? What did the disciples do? First thing they did, rejoice. Rejoice, why? What did they say? Now, I have to be honest, this is just a different way of thinking than most of us, okay? This is a little confession. I think that for me and for many of us, a lot of our prayer time is kind of like a Santa Claus list. Lord, please give me this, please help me with that, and vast majority of it is temporal things that we don't know whether it's God's will or not. And then we have these people, the disciples, who their life is on the line. They know that this could mean death for them. And they said, thank you, God, that I was able to suffer persecution for you. That's just a different mindset than what we have. And I think what Reluca was saying also is that persecution creates something different in the Christians. You either really believe what this is, or you're out of the church, man. You are not going to stand for that if persecution is going to happen. And is it possible that persecution is one of the ways that God purifies his church? And what did they do whenever they were asked not to talk about Jesus anymore? First thing they did is what? everywhere they went now. Everywhere they went, they talked more about Jesus. I love that. I love that. So they rejoiced that they were permitted to suffer for their faith, and they ignored the instructions to quit preaching, and they continued anyway. Now, think now about how this may happen in a place such as the United States. It will look like perhaps civil legislation. You cannot do this and such, or you must do thus and such. And think about when those things come in conflict with our faith. What will we do? Are you prepared to stand? Going on to question 5, this draws it out a little bit more. What else does the Bible suggest about the way Christians ought to relate to the government? So, another kind of thoughts along this matter, are there limits to how far believers should go in cooperating with civil powers? What criteria should apply when determining when civil disobedience might be appropriate? So, let's read a couple more Bible verses. Maybe this will help clarify the question and the answer in your mind. Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God. The authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? But what is good, and you do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. This is talking about the governing authorities. Therefore, you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience's sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render, therefore, to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs are due, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. That's talking about respecting the authorities. Another verse here, it says, if it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. And another verse from Acts chapter 5, verse 27. Now, we're actually finishing that story that we were talking about earlier about the disciples that had been beaten and released. It says, and when they had brought them, they set them before the council, and the high priest asked them, saying, did we not strictly command you not to teach in his name? And look, you fill Jerusalem with this doctrine, and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. Continuing on, it says, but Peter and the other disciples answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. Now, if you were paying close attention, you notice that there's kind of two approaches and two answers to the question here. What are the two answers, the two possible answers to how we respect the authorities of the land? Do you have your hand up, Kenneth? Exactly. I mean, you think of many stories like when the Pharisees tried to come to trap Jesus, and they asked him, hey, Jesus, should we pay taxes or not? And they were going to try to trap him. And what was Jesus' answer, right? He said, show me a coin, and whose face is on the coin? And he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. And so Jesus was not a tax evader. He did not teach the idea that the Romans were that the Romans in and of themselves are evil and we should try to get out from under them. He didn't teach that. And so now we're talking now, I know a lot of people have different strong feelings about our last president or our current president because they're very different. And some people are like, well, I'm not going to respect this president, or I'm not going to respect that president. And so the question comes, the second part of it is obey when possible, right? If you can, respect and obey when possible. But if it conflicts with God, you obey God. Let's go on here to the last question that we're going to do together. Question number 6. What is the ultimate prediction that Jesus makes? So the Bible accurately predicted this 10-year Diocletian persecution, right? Talking about Smyrna. But this has led people to think, oh man, all prophecies are just doom and gloom. Like everything in the book of Revelation, like, and I've heard many people say this, I don't read that book because it's just scary. Like it's just death and apocalypse and it's horrible, and I'm scared. I don't want to read that. But is all prophecy doom and gloom? What is really the end of prophecy all about? Let's read a few prophetic stories and predictions by Jesus. John chapter 14. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions, and if it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. Is that not a prophetic prediction? That is a beautiful prophetic prediction. Another one, let's read from Revelation, because people are so scared of that book. Let's see how Revelation actually comes to an end. Revelation 21, verses 1 through 5. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also there were no more seas. And then I, John, saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them. And they shall be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. Then he who sat on the throne said, behold, I make all things new. And he said to me, write, for these things are true and faithful. So we talked today about some kind of scary prophecies a little bit, persecution and whatnot. But we want to end on a different note, that not all prophecy is doom and gloom. Yeah, before the world comes to an end, there will be persecution. That's promised. That's promised. And if we believe we're living in the last days, we will see persecution in our lives. But that's not the end of the story. You ever pick up a book and cheat and read the last chapter? You ever done that before? Are any of you like me, like to go to the end and try to figure out what it's like before the story is all over? That's the way it is with God. We can flip to the last chapter. We know the end of the story. And that way we can have courage and faith that no matter what happens in between, in the interim, we know how it ends. And it ends with joy unspeakable together with God. And it will be so worth it. We'll look back and if anybody asks us, what was it like going through the last days of Earth's history? We'll say, I can't remember. That all seems so distant now. All I can see now is the beauty of heaven and the face of Jesus. Jesus says that he'll come again and he'll set up a kingdom that is very different than these kingdoms of the world. Well, let us have a prayer as we close today. Father in heaven, we thank you. We thank you that in spite of the fact that persecution is before us, before your followers, we thank you that that's not the end of the story, that the story ends so well. And we just ask, Lord, that you strengthen our hearts to be faithful now, so that if we are ever called to testify for your name, we will represent you in an honorable way. And we look forward to that time when you'll come back and all of this will be past and there'll be no more tears, no more crying, sorrow, or pain. And we'll be with you forever and ever. We ask this in the name of Jesus.